Good evening. Thank you for your patience. How is everybody this evening? It's warm. It's getting warmer. And it's just so interesting and beautiful to watch how this dialogue has been, did I just turn this off? Hello? Okay. How this dialogue has been transgressing through the seasons. And we started out in very, very, very cold winter, and now we're having a bit of a thaw. And so I see that as sort of synonymous with the discussion that we're having. You know, there's more hope in the air, there's more ideas and solutions, and it's just really making me very happy that spring is here. So good evening. And it's my job to welcome you to the new school. My name is Michelle DePass. For those of you that have not been following us as this lecture has been going on all semester, and I'm the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those joining us via live stream, and I encourage our online audience tonight to participate in the discussion by submitting your questions in the chat window on your screen. To our audience in the room, thank you all for choosing to spend your evening with us as we continue the Public Policy in Action Lecture Series. I invite everyone to participate in our ongoing conversation on social media by using the hashtag #PolicyForJustice. I repeat, hashtag #PolicyForJustice. The new school's mission is to prepare students to understand, contribute to, and succeed in a rapidly changing society, and thus make the world a better and more just place. This is a university that strives to foster creativity, innovation, and a desire to challenge the status quo, both in what and how we teach, and in the intellectual ambitions of the school itself. The new school uses social engagement to orient students' academic experience, to help them become critically engaged citizens dedicated to solving problems and contributing to the public good. The Milano School is proud to be taking an active role in achieving these goals by engaging with some of the most distinguished leaders in public policy, advocacy, and academia of our age. The 2015 Henry Cohen Lecture Series, Public Policy in Action, is devoted to advancing social equity in America. This series is examining how public policy serves as a vehicle to advance economic and social inclusion in the context of the evolving demographic, economic, and political shifts in America. This series serves as a catalyst for the continuing dialogue on the state of social justice in America. And we will explore topics including framing civil rights for the 21st century, changing demographics and the economic imperative, race, higher education, and social justice, measuring and influencing public opinion, and the new civil rights agenda. Tonight, I am incredibly proud to introduce our three speakers, John Powell, Noliwe Rooks, and Robin Hayes. And I have to say that with each week, we keep stepping up our game. This is an incredible dialogue that we're going to be having here tonight, and we have a commitment to critical dialogue. So I'm looking forward to the discussion that will be happening. John Powell, thank you for accepting our invitation. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. In addition to being a professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies, Professor Powell holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He is also the executive director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research with over 100 researchers to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practice that addresses disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics. Previously, Professor Powell founded and directed the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. And he was most recently the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio University and held the Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Moritz College of Law. Lest you think that that's all John has done, he has also served as the Director of Legal Services in Miami, and he was the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, where he was instrumental in developing educational adequacy theory. Professor Powell has worked and lived in Africa, where he is a consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa. He has also lived and worked in India and done work in South America and Europe. We're very excited to hear what Professor Powell is bringing to us today. We also have Professor Noliwe Rooks. Thank you. Noliwe Rooks is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work explores how race and gender both impact and are impacted by popular culture, social history, and political life in the US. She has also designed curriculum interventions which connect race-based curriculum with research-centered practicums and community and public policy-based social justice initiatives. Such courses offer students the opportunity to go beyond primarily studying social problems and begin to propose research-based solutions to real-world problems. She received her BA from Spelman, where she majored in English and graduated with honors and MA and PhD degrees in American Studies from University of Iowa. Rooks is the author of 3 books. The first, Hair Raising, Beauty Culture and African American Women, Ladies' Pages, African American Women's Magazines and the Culture That Made Them, and White Money, Black Power, African American Studies and the Crisis in Race in Higher Education. Rooks is currently an associate professor in Africana Studies and Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies at Cornell University, where she is also the director of graduate studies in Africana Studies. Our faculty discussant this evening is Professor Robin Hayes. East Flatbush, Brooklyn native, Robin Hayes, founded, yes, how many people live in Brooklyn? Yes. Founded Progressive Pupil in 2006. Hayes produced, directed, and co-wrote the documentary short, Beautiful Me, Finding Our Revolutionary Selves in Black Cuba, which was enthusiastically received by audiences at film festivals throughout the US and in Cannes. At the New School, Professor Hayes is an assistant professor of media studies, international affairs, nonprofit management, and urban policy. You could tell we are in for an exciting and stimulating evening. So without further ado, I welcome Professor John Powell.
Good evening. I'm going to, well, first of all, I want to thank the New School, and I feel like I'm coming home. I have so many friends here, including people from California, but also people I've known for many years, including the time that I lived here in New York. I see my friend Susan Vesta, who's supported me in my struggles as I lived in Brooklyn. And I want to welcome all of you to this talk tonight. So I'm going to be talking about the shrinking of public space and what that means for us both as a society and in terms of social justice. I want to start with the notion of neoliberalism, which is a term that many of you have heard. But I want to suggest that neoliberalism that we're experiencing today is very different than anything that we experienced before 1970, 75. And what do I mean by neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is basically a structure where the government is not responsive to people, either because it's not capable or not interested, and instead, it's actually responsive to the market in a fundamentalist way. In that new role, which is not necessarily the shrinking of government, but the repurposing of government, it actually has a role of, again, the market on one hand, and policing the population, especially the other, and keeping the world safe for capitalism. Now, the thing that's different about this expression of neoliberalism that we're experiencing today is actually being supported by foot soldiers in a populist movement. So if the vehicle that's driving a lot of things that we care about into the ground is neoliberalism, what's the gas? What fuels it? What fuels it is the fear of the other. The fear of the other. So if you think about all the stuff that we're seeing about growing inequality, about deregulation, almost everyone takes us back to the early 70s as to when that happened. What was going on in the 1970s that would fuel this neoliberalism? What was going on was a reaction to the civil rights movement. And so the idea that the civil rights movement was somehow invading our society, invading our public space, our schools, our homes, our hospital, really created this tremendous anxiety that the elite were able to capitalize on in a new movement. It took them a while to hit full strides, but they did. And a colleague and a friend of mine, Ian Haney Lopez, has written a book about this called Dog Whistle Politics. The idea that you deal with race or religion, but you don't name it as such. So that you claim that, no, I'm colorblind. This is not about race, it's about welfare, or this is about personal responsibility. And so it's a dog whistle that some people don't hear and other people's hear. What's unique about this, then, is it ties the macroeconomy, our political structure, with growing anxiety about the racial other. It's not saying necessarily there's racial disparities. It's not saying what's happening with black people or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans per se. It's saying the very structure of the design of our economy and our democracy is being driven by this fear of the other. And that's a connection that most of us fail to make. And it has global implication. Professor Saskin, who teaches right up the street at Columbia, has talked about that we're seeing expulsions. We're seeing large groups of people being expelled from society, and it's happening all over the world. Well, when you think about it, the anxiety about the other is actually happening all over the world as well. Putnam first wrote about this in the early 1990s about Europe, about the growing Muslim population in Europe was causing Europe to rethink its public space, including welfare. And he warned that unless we did something, we'd see a diminution of the welfare state in Europe in reaction to the other. So again, the same dynamics. He sort of got blasted for that because it seemed so extreme at the time. No one could think in the early 90s that Europe was going to rethink its welfare state. And it has put really powerful implications for advocates, for policymakers, really for all of us. And how do we think about addressing these issues? So the militarization of the police is a natural consequence of this. In fact, we can go back and actually trace it to some of the early expressions of Nixon and Reagan as they call for, Nixon calling for law and order. He was not talking about crime in terms of burglaries and robberies. He was talking about black people being out of order. Black people being out of order. He's, again, speaking to the anxiety of a hardcore number of whites. But Reagan wasn't going to be outdone, so he actually said, let's have a war on drugs. And I wrote at the time that he was really declaring a war on black people, and that once you have a war, you have the infinite other. You have tanks on the ground. Now, we know that we have multiple beings, multiple ways of organizing our sense of being. And the dominant one in the public discourse is really economics. So when you think of Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? He's saying, how come conservative whites or moderate whites vote against their interests? I want to suggest to you they're not voting against their interests. They may be voting against their economic interests, but that's just one way in which our being is organized. Another way is political. We talk about power and empowerment, be able to affect the environment, to be able to self-actualize. We understand that that's important in terms of a sense of well-being. But the third area is what I call ontological, or a sense of who we are, what's our collective meaning in life, why are we here, what gives us a purpose. In philosophy, they call it ontological. That's the area that's actually driving politics today. That as we rupture this notion that this is a white country, whatever that means, being a white country. And we have an explication of what it means to be a white country by Samuel Huntington, who's written a book titled, not what we have, but who are we? And he tells us who we are. One of the things he says is that we're not an immigrant country, we're a settler country. The country was settled by certain people, and anyone coming after have to adhere to those same norms and values. And who settled America, Professor Huntington? Well, he goes beyond saying white people, although he doesn't say white because he's written this book recently. He's too smart for that. He has his own dog whistle. He says two groups settled the country. They were the Anglos and the Saxons. They were Protestants. They were English-speaking. And he goes on to describe functionally what we think of as core white Americans. And he said, anyone else who comes who don't adhere to those values are not welcome. I'm suggesting that this deep anxiety about who we are, which leans into what I call a sense of our spiritual grounding, our collective spiritual grounding, is something that liberals have a hard time embracing. So we don't actually participate in that. Conservatives are actually more comfortable talking about our collective sense of grounding than liberals are. So we actually ignore that. And the conservatives have been able to strategically use this anxiety about who we are to actually foment a populist movement for neoliberalism. So when people say, let's take back America, they're not talking about taking back America from the elites. They're not talking about taking back America from corporations. They're talking about taking back America from the other, from President Obama, from Muslims, from immigrants. They're talking about reestablishing this as a Anglo-Saxon country, if you will. When you ask Americans about how they feel about diversity, the blue line represents what people say. The red line represents what their unconscious says. And you can see in almost every case, people are much more anxious at the unconscious level than they are at the explicit level. And I'm not thinking that people are necessarily lying, but this idea of diversity is really problematic in America, and we're not leaning into it. In fact, most of us go around celebrating it, like, yay, more black people, more Latinos. And the unconscious is saying, whoa, what are we going to do about that? Maybe the Tea Party. When you look at political polarization, which social scientists have done, political polarization started, again, if you can read this chart and I'll make it available to you, started in the late 60s and started picking up. And political polarization actually preceded economic polarization. What that means is that the growing inequality we see today is actually a function of political polarization. People rewriting the rules, changing the game, so that the elite could actually hold on to more. So if we're going to fix the economy, in some ways we could say the economic polarization we see is not an economic problem. It's actually a political problem. Again, that's being driven by the anxiety about the other. And this is a book called Deeply Divided. And the author makes the point that you can't understand the deep divide in the country today without understanding the role of race. Which is different than saying, understand what black people have, Latinos, and so on. It's saying there's something fundamental. We haven't been this divided as a country since the Civil War. What's driving it? Again, if the car is neoliberalism, the gas is the anxiety about the other. Now one might wonder, why would the elite be stoking this racial anxiety, this other anxiety, this immigrant anxiety? Do they don't like black people? Do they hate immigrants? Not at all. It's strategic for them because they understand that if they can shrink government, then government cannot tax or regulate them. It allows them to actually control government. So this is strategic for their purposes. So you see the expression of neoliberalism in two ways: rolling back the rights of marginalized people, otherizing people, and at the same time repurposing the federal government. And it affects the structures we live in and the design of those structures. So it's not simply something that's stated in terms of personal animus. In fact, many people will go to great lengths to say, no, I have black friends or Latino friends, but it's affecting the very design and seeing what happens with those designs. So every school district you look at almost, every housing that you look at is deeply segregated, race, income, gender, and yet people are espousing an ideology of colorblindness and inclusion. When we look at structures, we have to look at how those structures organize our lives. What are the outcomes, not the intent? So we're here in New York, which is one of the most liberal cities in the United States and one of the most segregated cities in the United States. I have a friend who, I probably shouldn't say this, but I have a friend who's involved in housing, on the housing board here in New York, and I'm sure you heard about them building a new housing project, not something 1,000 years ago today, for upper middle class, and they have low-income housing or moderate housing in the project, but the people who have the moderate housing have their separate entryway. They can't use the same entryway that middle-class people can use. This is today that we're seeing this sort of deeply divide in terms of structure. We're not saying the people going in the front door are necessarily races or classes, but the structure of it creates a segmentation between people. So again, Saskian believes that if this inequality keeps happening, we'll see more and more people expelled, and she has a book called Expulsion, from society. Now, one of the things that drives this and that confuses us is we have this notion that the public is bad. And the public is not bad because it's necessarily bad, but because who's in it? As non-whites have come into the public, we have actually problematized the public. Whether it's public schools, whether it's public housing, whether it's public transportation. We have communities that refuse federal money for public transportation because they're afraid of who's going to use it. And so instead, we've attacked the public in the name of private is better. Now, what I'm suggesting is that instead of being public and private being two domains, we actually have at least 4 domains. Public, collective action, government. Private, which is the way the architects of this country thought of private as individuals and small artisans that will actually do stuff without the eyes of government watching over them. The third category is non-public, non-private, and the fourth category is corporate. And in some ways, there's this tension between the corporate and the public. And what the corporate has figured out how to do, and they've been doing this for the last 100 years, is to claim that they are the private, to claim that they are just like people. They deserve the same protection from the government as people. And so what we see is this big fight between the role of government and corporate. And in doing so, what corporate does is shrinks the public, it actually shrinks the private, and it expands the non-public, non-private. Now, what's the non-public, non-private? The non-public, non-private is where the most marginal in society live. It's where, if you're homeless, you don't have a public voice. You can't effectively petition government, nor do you have a private place to retreat to. There's actually one jurisdiction in California that's passed a new ordinance that makes it against the law to have body odor in public. So they're saying, so where are the homeless supposed to be? There was one jurisdiction in Florida that passed an ordinance made it illegal to urinate in public. There's another jurisdiction that made it unlawful to sleep in public. And so they're saying this community have no public voice and no private place to retreat to. So part of it is that we have a misalignment. Corporation is claiming private space that belong to people. And in doing so, they're actually pushing people out of that space. So part of the thing is that we see San Francisco, New York, the sort of expansion of people who are literally in the non-public, non-private space. And we simply don't have the ability or the will to do anything about it. I gave a lecture earlier and I talked to the students and I talked about Dred Scott, which most Americans have heard of. Most people don't realize though that Dred Scott was a case about corporations, not primarily about slaves, about corporations. Corporations was claiming in the 1850s that they were citizens for the purpose of diversity jurisdiction, so that states could not regulate them. And the South was concerned that if you extend the mantle of citizenship to corporations, wouldn't you have to extend it to blacks? And the court came up with a solution. No, we're going to create a special super subordinate category for blacks that will pave the way to extend this to corporations. And so we see to this day, as corporate prerogative expands, the rights of people are contracted. And if I had time, I could take you through this history that's quite replete with examples of, again, give you just one example. How many of you have heard of the Gilded Age, or sometimes called the Lochner Age? Have any of you heard of that age? What most people don't realize is that the Gilded Age, the Lochner Age, and the Jim Crow Age is the same age. That is, the age in which we are consigning and regulating blacks in extreme measures under law is the same period where we're expanding the prerogative of corporations and giving them greater and greater protections. It's the same age, the same court, under the same laws. It's kind of amazing when you see this. And we study these things side by side as if they are unconnected. They're profoundly connected. And we hear many people, including former presidential candidate Mitt Romney, musing, well, corporations, aren't they people too? And the Supreme Court just changed the rules of the game to basically say all this stuff in terms of restricting the right to actually affect the political process with money, that's wrong. Again, under the guise that corporations are somehow just like the rest of us. I should make it clear, and I do in my writings, my book, and others, that I'm not categorically opposed to corporations. If they are aligned in the right way, if they are there to serve the democratic republic and people. But we flipped it. We're now, everything is aligned to actually serve corporation, including our would-be democracy. So this is what I call the circle of human concern, and this is actually empirical. We can measure where people are, how people are perceived in terms of their humanity. There's a part of the brain that's called the frontal lobe that when you see another human being, we're wired to recognize our fellow species. So when we see a human being, the frontal lobe goes off, boop, it lights up. It turns out that when people are othered to the extreme, that part of the brain does not light up. That at unconscious level, there are populations that we simply do not see as human. It's worse than that, because there is part of the brain that lights up when we see homeless people, but it's a part of the brain associated with disgust. And I've written saying we can't develop effective policy for people that we don't see as human and disgusting. And so undocumented immigrants, Muslims, ex-offenders all fall outside of what I call the circle of human concern. Now, we can do things to actually bring people back into the circle, but instead we're doing more and more to exclude people from the circle of human concern. And I assert, as does Soskin, that as you expand the rights of corporation and give them more and more rights associated with people, that at some point you have all people exposed and expelled from the circle of human concern, that simply the role of government is no longer there, either in its capacity or in its will to actually protect people. And some of you may know this Marxist radical in Italy worries about what happens when we expand the rights of corporations beyond a certain point. This process of denying people human dignity and their right to petition government is something I also call othering. And othering basically denies people their humanity. And so the process is belonging. We all need to belong to a society that we can make claims on, or othering. And what we see, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of disability, in terms of sometimes the other religion, is that we say some groups don't belong, they're other. But again, it's not just a psychological phenomena, it's how we structure our societies, how we spend our money, it's how we talk about them, it's how they show up. And we do all this, again, through the lens of the dog whistle. So states' rights, we used to say states' rights mean black wrongs. Law and order. When I was growing up, there was one television program that dealt with law and order. It was Dragnet. Today, you cannot turn on any television almost any time of day where there's law and order on every channel. And again, this goes back to black people are out of order. We need laws to make sure they stay in order. The civil rights movement was out of order. That's what Selma was about. These people are out of order. How do we get them back in order? Which really means, how do we get them back in their place as the subjugated other? How dare they think they have the right to live in the same community that we live in? How dare they think they have the right? So you have the social dominance. And then, of course, Reagan's thing in terms of war on drugs and his starting his campaign, as you know, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where blacks have been killed, to say, I'm for you, those who want to reassert the dominance of whites. And so segregation is not simply one group being segregated from another, it's groups being segregated from opportunity, being segregated from dignity of human concern. So corporations, again, may make good servants, but they make bad masters. We simply don't have the capacity now. We've restructured society since the 70s to actually weaken government's ability to actually control corporations, to regulate them on behalf of human beings. So in closing, let me just say this is a global phenomenon. And the things we care about, whether it's the environment, schools, good roads, basic infrastructure, healthcare, none of those things are sustainable without an effective, responsive, and inclusive government. Now, right now, it's hard to actually believe that we can have that because government, we have people who run for government for the very purpose of breaking it even more. And then they use the fact that government is not working as a justification to take more away from the government and, quote unquote, privatize it, give it to corporations. I'm saying that's simply not sustainable. So if you care about civil rights, care about groups, care about the environment, we have to figure out a way of both making government responsive, designing it to be responsive, and at the same time, making corporations a servant to people instead of its master. Thank you.
I want to start, I actually have a big kind of observation, and then I have 4 things I want you to help me think about, right? In solving, in fixing some of what Professor Powell talked about, the ground has shifted in some certain kinds of ways that I'm struggling to figure out, to get ahead of, right? And so I'm gonna ask you to talk back to me about how we can do this, because y'all are policy people. The first thing, though, I started off talking in the class beforehand because I find this intriguing. The last book that I wrote focused on how the Ford Foundation institutionalized Black studies, right? And what that story is there's a man named McGeorge Bundy who was National Security Advisor in both the Kennedy and Johnson administration during the beginning of Vietnam, right? In 1964, he leaves the government and discovers, he says, literally, 1964, he goes to talk to a civil rights group called National Urban League. Y'all know who that is, right? Like, I tend to talk to people like they don't know these things, so don't hate me. He goes to talk to the National Urban League, and he gives this big speech to a room full of folks who have spent the past few years working on civil rights, and he says, you know, we have a Negro problem in the country. People are protesting for things. People want this thing called Black Power, and he claims he didn't know that this level of unrest was going on, because he'd been messing around with Vietnam. He'd been in the White House. He'd been focused on foreign policy. The domestic was simply, even though it's happening right outside the door, it's happening in real time, just not in his frame of reference. So he gets out, he takes over what is then by far the largest philanthropic organization in the world. And he says, what we're going to fix is the Negro problem. What we're going to fix is structural inequality. What we're going to focus on is black power, which I think makes all the sense in the world. 1964, by 1973, he was over it. But 1964, he's all about figuring out how to make sure that this thing that people are starting to talk about, this black power, that he can help to address it, because he sees it as a way of bringing about the systemic changes that he wants to bring about. He decides that black studies, that having black faculty on campuses to help to desegregate both the faculties as well as the curriculums, right, for the next generation is a quick way to get there. You with me? Like, you get that far? Yeah? All right, so he's sort of like, if I'm gonna get the next generation, what I need is at the moment where they're being educated, I need these folks to be talking to them. At the same time, I just discovered the way that kind of Columbus discovered things, right? I discovered that at the same time, in the 1970s, he also decides that he wants to refocus policy schools. And he and the board and the Ford Foundation start pumping millions of dollars, again, short period of time, 1974, all these things start happening where folks are kind of like, these philanthropies are socially engineering America. And they have entirely too much money and too much free reign to do it. And Nixon actually launches an investigation and has them, like, they start losing money. So all of this starts coming to a screeching halt at a certain point, because it's just simply depleting their endowments. But in this moment, this idea that higher education is the site for fixing what's wrong, right? Not just studying it, not analyzing it, not collecting data about it, not teaching dogma, not teaching paradigms, but fixing. For a moment, there's a moment where the Ford Foundation and a lot of young people believe that education is key, that it's crucial to getting this stuff right. And I want to believe that we can go back to that moment. I want to believe that there are people, if not just in the country, maybe in the room, who literally would like for some of these issues around race and education, some of the issues that around corporations being people and what that means, for y'all to start thinking creatively about how do you fix it? Put policy schools out of business, right? You fix the problems they're supposed to be fixing. There's no reason for them. Put Black studies out of business. I'm sorry, Michelle. I'm sorry. I feel like it's a long way off. I feel like we're good for right now, right? Like the things that, the social ills that we want to study, have a subset of you who want to do more than study it, learn about it, right? Put your mind toward fixing it. I think that, okay, so I'm gonna skip to what I think you need to think about, be aware of, as you put your mind toward fixing some of these social ills. I am not a historian by training. Historians never think that I'm a historian, but I like history a lot, so I'm always wanting to go back and contextualize. A historian will tell you in a minute, she is not. She's an interdisciplinary scholar from American studies. She does cultural studies and stuff. That is not history. But I'd like to contextualize the present with what's going on in the past. And I hear a lot of people today, as we celebrate all these 50th anniversaries, you know, they're coming kind of hot and heavy, right? You know, either we haven't gone far enough, or we have gone far. You know, President Obama just said, we got a Black president and we got a Black, Attorney General. We got to have a Black woman Attorney General. Like, this is progress. At the moment that he is standing in a city that is desperately poor, whose school system is broken to the point where no one's clear how to fix it, where unemployment is amongst some groups almost 40%, right? For young people, man, 40%. That's a structural inequality. So at the moment that we want to sing these praises about walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, no small thing, because put yourself in those steps and you really wonder what it takes to walk across a bridge when somebody's got a baton waiting to beat you in the head and you know it's coming. It's not a surprise. You know because you're looking around at what's happening. So it's no small thing. But the celebration without acknowledging where we are. I think there are a number of things that we need to pay attention to if we're going to move forward. One, today I find it surprising trying to figure out what to do with it and solving some of these problems, that from millennials on up, according to a couple of different studies, white people seem to believe they are the object of racial aggression and disenfranchisement, right? Wrap your mind around that. Right now, according to one, MTV did a study, which I think is actually very interesting that MTV has started to produce data about the people who watch what they do, right? Not just watch, but actually start asking them questions. And they did one about racial attitudes of millennials, right? And in this study, what they found is that 91% say of millennials say that all people should be treated equally regardless of race, right? That's good, we're all there. Who's actually not going to say that in this day and age? But they think that racism is also a thing of the past. They're uncomfortable with actual conversations about race. And almost half of those who are white believe discrimination against white people is just as big of a problem as discrimination against people of color. These things are connected though. The discomfort with talking about race. And when I say talking about race, as someone who teaches class, I teach at predominantly white institution. I've never taught, I went to Spelman. I spent the last 15 years at Princeton, and the last 3 I've been at Cornell. My classes are integrated, and we have to talk about race, and one of my former students is over here. I'm not actually gonna make her stand up and recite anything. But very often I will talk to, the students about who taught you to talk about race? What did you learn? How did you learn how to talk about it? And most of what we are taught today is just say all people are the same, all people are equal. It's a bad thing to discriminate. It's bad to notice race. It's almost racist to talk about race. So, and this is not just white people, let me say. This is all black people, this is all people. We don't do a good job of teaching people how to talk about race in productive ways. And so you have people who, in the absence of that conversation, and looking at some of the policy that we're seeing unfold, actually believe. Think about the spate of affirmative action cases, right, that we've seen recently. Since Bakke, y'all know Bakke, the first reverse discrimination case. So he was a medical student and his scores were higher than some black applicants. And so he said, why am I being kept out, right? This has become the model for affirmative action cases, which really, if you strip it down, are all about white people saying, white plaintiffs saying, there's some black people taking my spot, that's not fair. That's not colorblind. That's not making me feel good, right? Do you see that, or do you think I'm making things up? Literally, do you see what, if I don't want to take you through all of the cases because I don't have time, but the last few, trust me when I tell you, it is about white plaintiffs saying, there are black people getting into school and I'm not, and so my rights have been violated. There's a number of spaces in our culture that you can look at where the outrage at the policy level is about protecting white rights from unfair inclusion of black people. And so you have this moment where a whole bunch of folks, there was also a Harvard and Tufts study a few years ago that also did a similar set of interviews where the majority of people said that whites have now replaced blacks as the primary victims of racial discrimination, and that anti-white prejudice is a bigger problem than the prejudice that African Americans face. So as we think about solving these problems, that's not to just go like, oh my God, how horrible. If that's real, that's something that's on the table that y'all gonna have to figure out how to work with, right? If it's true that there are numbers, and there's a quarter of black people, I should say, who in these studies held the same views, that anti-white prejudice was higher, was of more concern in contemporary America than was anti-black, right? So again, you're gonna have to help me think about it because I'm working with, what do you do? I'm working with, how do you fix it when who we believe is being harmed has changed? The other thing, between 1981 and 2012, I only have 4 of these, so I told you I'll move out here. Between 1981 and 2012, researchers at Princeton, I'm sure y'all heard, recently said we have moved from an oligarchy, which goes with this Gilded Age kind of thing. You know what an oligarchy is, right? This was like money rich people are deciding things, as opposed to a democracy. That right now, in looking at the laws that have been enacted in that 30-year period, overwhelmingly, the laws that are on the books are the laws that corporations, people with money, or just individuals with money now, you don't even need to be a corporation, you don't even need to be a business, you can just be a billionaire and figure out how to start buying things in people and get the world to look like what you want to look like. And what they said is, one of the things that people don't often notice is because sometimes disenfranchised people, the corporation actually wants the same thing you do for whatever reason, for reasons you may not be able to see, blah, blah. So sometimes people will say, well, we won that one. That was democracy at work, right? And they're looking at it and going, yeah, no, in an overwhelming number of cases. So if that's true, and again, just because some academics said it doesn't make it true, but if that's true, what do you do to fix this if the vote, right, that we're always, whatever something jumps off what we say, the problem is those people need to be voting. If they were registered and if they were voting, Ferguson, police officers should be, if the people would come out and vote, this would not be happening. There would not be tanks in the street. It's their fault, right? What do you do with that if it's true that it's not about the vote? That it's about an oligarchy where people with money are making the decisions that benefit them. How do you start to fight back? What kind of policy do you need? What kind of rhetoric? What kind of organizing? And I think that those two things are not often a part. When we talk about change, those two are not part of the conversation very often. Just got 2 more, moving out. Whereas Professor Powell talked about, we really literally believe that poverty is the fault of the impoverished. It's not just that people are enacting laws that makes homelessness and poverty illegal, which they are all over the country. And there is almost no public discussion of it, which is interesting. You know, every so often you'll see a little blip. Somebody will say, it's just terrible they wouldn't let the people sleep outside in their car. But for the most part, municipalities, this is not federal legislation, this is local, all politics are local, are enacting laws that really, if you strip it down, are criminalizing poverty, right? Because usually they want you to not be where you are. If we believe, and that the way to deal with that has to do with philanthropic and charitable organizations addressing poverty and addressing homelessness, which is what a majority of folks also believe. It's either individual responsibility of the poor to get over that, to fix themselves, or surely there's some sort of philanthropy or charity that can handle it, not government. If we believe that charity is the same thing as justice, what is it? What do we do? If the majority of us believe that. Hopefully none of y'all believe that. I'm talking to you as if these are not your beliefs, but if they are, you're in good company. And the last thing, how do we deal with these issues around inequality, equity, racism, and white supremacy when we literally believe that white supremacy is a thing of the past and that a white supremacist can only be known because they're wearing a hood and dragging a flaming cross with a dead black person behind them. Then we'll maybe say, that looks like a racist. That looks like a white supremacist. There is probably something race-based that we need to address there. In the absence of overt markers of racism and white supremacy that we all agree on, very often we will say, it is not clear to me that that's what that is. The most recent example I can give you is these Ferguson emails. So, the Justice Department had a 102-page report documenting systemic oppression against folks who are overwhelmingly Black and overwhelmingly poor. But the only folks who have been fired so far are some people who wrote emails to each other that didn't actually put anybody in jail, didn't impoverish them. They're fired. The mayor, the chief of police, everybody else is still there. But we're like, that's race, that right there. They wrote emails, they were disrespectful, there's no place for it, let's get rid of them, they are responsible. When white supremacy, we don't think it actually exists. We think personal responsibility, unfortunate attitudes, a little bit of education is what's needed to fix it. How do you fix systemic problems where the system seems to believe that Black inferiority exists, where the system seems to think that anti-Blackness is profitable? How do you, I'm really asking because I don't have answers to this, right? How do we start to fix it? And the last two things that I just want to point out, as you think about how to fix it, is the different ways we respond when the charges of racism are leveled on behalf of Black people. Somebody says, Black people or people of color, when somebody says there's racism directed against them versus when the charges are leveled at people who are non of color. And just to break it down is basically what I said. When Black people say there's racism out there and it needs to be addressed, overwhelmingly, not gonna go through all of it, but overwhelmingly the response is there's some personal responsibility that you need to get with. If your parents were present, they would have taught you better. You probably wouldn't have got shot. If you had not been wearing pants down on your hips, nobody would have thought you were a criminal. If you didn't have the hoodie on, you wouldn't have scared the poor white people. It very often comes down to some sort of act when the charge is racism and it's saying that there is anti-Black racism afoot, that the person who is, to my mind, the victim, in my worldview, is the victim, is somehow responsible, or the fix involves some sort of responsibility on the part of that community, as opposed to when the charge is racism, and as I told you, when the person is non-Black, non of color, the courts often step in to say, yeah, no. This is particularly devastating. I'm writing a book right now on white supremacy and Black education, and the history of what happens with that around the education of Black people. Up to and including, one of the things that I'm discovering is you want to clear out a neighborhood, you integrate a school, right? We have a lot of narratives around when housing gets integrated. What happens? The whole house flips. People in white communities will, it's a celebrity death match when Black people want to come to the school, but should they get in the school, that is like leading to white flight in ways that I had not, till I started this project. It really started to kind of trace some of what was going on. There's a total realignment in urban areas. In some urban areas, like, okay, I'm not gonna go to, but this is my baby, right? So I could stand up here all day and start talking about what we're not talking about with white supremacy and Black education, but up to and including things like education. What we see often is if the charge is, if white people can say, we want to send our school to our children, our white children, to this predominantly Black school because we believe in integration. We want that. We think that's a good thing. Or the folks in Charlotte, North Carolina are like, well, integration's been working. We've worked hard for it. We want to keep it. The court is like, yeah, no. Because if your child goes to this school, some rigmarole somehow, the other white people will be disadvantaged. So you, one white person who wants to send your child to an integrated school, you cannot. This is the Supreme Court. It's constantly telling parents, you cannot. We're not here for that. So Right, so put that on the table. Let's think about that. And then I was going to tell you a couple of little stories that I don't actually think are important, but I will conclude with it was just some more fleshing it out. And like I said, I'd much rather have the conversation than to hear me talk about the little stories. But I do want to conclude with James Baldwin, who I always want to say something involving James Baldwin, who said, words like freedom, justice, democracy are not common concepts. On the contrary, they're rare. People are not born knowing what these are. It takes enormous and above all individual effort to arrive at the respect for other people these words imply.
Let's just take a second and let all that sink in. That was so much. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking both Noliwe and John for their presentations and their super interesting, super thoughtful presentations, which represent long, I should say, very robust bodies of work. I'm just going to offer some very quick thoughts based on what they said, just as a jumpstart for our conversation. I'll be moderating the discussion, so really look forward to your input as well. And live streamers, we will be getting your comments and questions as well. So again, my name is Robin Hayes. I'm a professor here at the Milano School. I'm also the founder, as was mentioned, of an organization called Progressive Pupil, and we make Black studies for everybody. So I think I'm extra excited about everything that's been said. I just want to pose some possible answers to the questions that John and Noliwe raised. And the first, to me, is about this issue of the circle of human concern. I think that, part of helping us understand that we need to expand rather than reduce the circle of human concern is lifting up our mutual investment in human rights and being able to truly enjoy human rights. In our country, we have a much more prominent discourse around civil rights being something that are afforded by the state. Of course, a shrinking state has less rights to give. But the enjoyment of human rights, if people have read the Declaration of Human Rights, involves things that we are all very much concerned about if we are to believe any of the most recent election polls, right? A guarantee of security, right? A right to an education, the right to sovereignty, right? The right to having a meaningful political voice, right? So the more of us who are human, the more of us can work together for the not just having the human rights, but the true enjoyment of these human rights. I think that's essential. And that may require some of us abandoning a fantasy of mobility, right? Part of what keeps us in the game of othering and participating or defending the othering of certain kinds of people is we feel that we are going to get real benefits from being in this in-group. Maybe not today when our work is being increasingly casualized and our housing prices are increasingly unaffordable and we don't know how we're going to properly educate our children, but someday we're going to get on Survivor, right? We're going to hit lotto. And those lotto figures, they chase you around New York City, don't they? The lotto jackpot everywhere you go, right? Someday we're going to be in that in-group, and so we feel like there's something in it for us for othering. But in fact, while we're waiting for that day to come, our human rights are being increasingly diminished. Also, I thought it was very interesting, Noliwe, what you talked about this personal responsibility, the comeback of a personal responsibility narrative as we have less and less autonomy over where we live. Some of us feel that our debt precludes us from being in healthy relationships, right? Is deciding what kind of families we're going to have, where we can live, what kind of work we can do, if we can do creative work. And yet we're told more and more, you need to exercise your personal autonomy when the conditions for exercising that autonomy, especially for young people, is more restrictive than ever, right? And so I think it's helpful to think about collective action, social movement participation as a way of expressing your personal responsibility. This probably isn't what President Obama means, right? When he tells the kids at Morehouse who have graduated from college, most of us would think that's personal responsibility, right? That's a good example, right? But when he tells them, hey, take personal responsibility, he probably doesn't mean go to Ferguson and put your body on the line to stop the militarization of the police force in this country, to demand the president advance racial justice. But I think that one can think of that as a way of expressing personal responsibility, and perhaps the most reasonable venue or means of expressing personal responsibility that's available to us in this recession. Of course, I have a PhD in African American Studies. Yes to that. Right now, in the United States, there are about 12 universities offering a graduate degree in African American Studies. I'm one of about 250 people in human history who have earned a PhD in Black Studies, Africana Studies, African Diaspora Studies, and many names, right? Same goal. And so I think African American Studies, like women's and gender studies, ethnic studies, emerging gay and lesbian studies, all of which are consistently under attack, all of which have emerged from social justice movements, all of which have played a critical role in understanding how big this circle of human concern is in our country and internationally. All of these programs of study are interdisciplinary, and I think what's really important about interdisciplinarity, which is something we lift up here at the New School, is the way that these programs of study connect history, culture, and structures of inequality, right? So they help us understand how these three things work together, right? So we know that part of history is understanding how humanity has the human experience over time. The exclusion of people of color, for example, from articulations of history has been part of the work of excluding people of color from this circle of human concern. How we've come to learn that women and people of color and gay and lesbian people are less than human. Right? So of course, these interdisciplinary programs have reinserted us back into history and therefore back into humanity. But also a focus on culture is very important because a lot of our experience is not archived properly through circumstances outside of our control. Right? And those of you, some of you are in my International Black Social Movements class, we've just been talking about how is even the Black Lives Matter movement being archived right now. Many of these tweets, many of these Instagram posts are owned by corporations, right? How will that experience and that success be documented? And then also, as Noliwe and John have discussed, right, structures of inequality. And I think that that is something, understanding how policies and practices have worked over time to create oppression, right, is the essence of understanding racism and how racism really works. And that is very different from prejudice, right, or bias, which is, of course, important to address, right? But we have seen from the documentation of Thomas Jefferson's angst about slavery, unbiased people can create racist policies, right? So there is a tenuous connection between whether or not someone has prejudice and whether or not they're going to perpetuate things that cause premature death for people of color and Black people in particular. Okay? And so I think when people say, but my best friends are Black, it's like, I don't need to be your best friend to live, right? Right. Don't need to be your best friend to live, right? You don't have to like me, right? Okay, so I don't have to come to dinner, okay? Yes. So answering Noliwe's question and John's implied question, well, where do we go from here? What do we do? I think it is very much helpful to think about our political voice as something that is bigger than or louder than voting. It, of course, includes voting, but that is one step or action that we're allowed to take, right? We can also participate in social movements. We can also express ourselves, right? In our communities, in our classrooms, in our schools, in our organizations. We can also support efforts at the local level for community empowerment, right? So even before thinking about voting, when was the last time some of it went to a community board meeting, right? In my neighborhood right now, they're trying to demolish the one grocery store. A lot of senior citizens depend on that grocery store. They can't get further than that, especially in the winter time, right? There's community board meetings about how do we save this grocery store and stop the development, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do, again, to take personal responsibility to move things forward. So I would say, in thinking about the role that higher education plays in that, interdisciplinary studies are essential. Black studies is essential to advancing our understanding of racial justice. If you want to learn more about what we do at Progressive Pupil, you can go to progressivepupil.org. You can look for our documentary, which is coming out later this month, called Black in Cuba. You can find that at blackincuba.org. And now I would love to hear your questions and comments. I think Noliwe and John, if you can join me on the dais. I'm sure you're also very thirsty from spitting all that fire, as the kids say.
Look how y'all stayed for Q&A, didn't run from the room. You're to be commended, really.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for such a rich presentation and set of ideas. And I guess my question is the observation of Powell, John Powell, speaking about common identity that's increasingly being created because of the space corporations are taking in the circle of concern, suggesting a mutuality, and then Ms. Rooks, Dr. Rooks, is revealing the persistence of racial division. So, you know, we have a reason to be common, but then there's this perpetuated and changed. Now it's white people are being discriminated. So reconciling those two realities, how do they exist so strongly at the same time?
Well, okay, but the reality of the wanting to cut me, and I think I understood Professor Powell to be saying this is aspirational, that we need to understand the whole othering and the role of othering and white supremacy and aspire to do some things to fix it. I don't think that they're existing. I mean, I think we're both sort of saying the same thing about what is. And it's a more, I will tell you, this it's not even to be flipped, but it is a little flip, but one of the things that has a long history is people saying, you know, we could get rid of all these racial divisions if we would, well, I just saw Walter White, who used to be the something for the NAACP, the second in command, somebody help me with some black studies. What was Walter White with the NAACP? I really cannot remember. Anyway, he was up there. He wasn't the president, but he was up there. He said, what people need to do is get some skin lightening. And the black people, literally, he published an article in the Outlook magazine, like telling people in 49, if you get you some skin lightening, dark-skinned people, and put that on, then you can maybe lighten yourself up, and then the white people won't be mad at you anymore. Which, okay, but before you start laughing, like this was just a little moment kind of thing. But then you start looking at this baseball player who used to be dark and now is not, Sammy Sosa, right? And then there's the Nigerian pop singer who's busy telling everybody who'll listen, what I need you to do is get you some skin lightening, because if you're brown, you're ugly, and white people will like you if you're light. Like, there is really an unfortunate narrative about how to deal with anti-Black racism that has a long history, that is literally get you some bleach and get rid of it. And then you too can possibly live a life like a white person. It's not really possible, but people keep suggesting. Or at least the woman in Nigeria she's aggressive about it. Y'all know this woman, right? Y'all know I'm not making this up, right? Like, this woman is aggressive, yeah.
And just to add a couple of things, because people suffer similar indignations does not in and of itself create a common cause or a common identity. And we know that. We know that there's tremendous tension between dispossessed people. For years, people used to get confused. It's like, well, how are the Jews treating Palestinians like that? They were treated badly themselves. So we can't assume that conditions will create the commonality or the shared humanity. We have to do that. We have to be much more deliberate in that. And one of the mistakes, which I was suggesting in that thing about ontological, political, and economic, is that for too long we've assumed that people's economic similarities should be the driver for a common identity. You only have to think about what's happening anywhere, really, but think about the Middle East. We get really confused. Sunnis and Shiites, aren't they all Muslims? What are they fighting about? What are they killing each other about? So it's conceivable, hopefully it won't happen, but it's conceivable that corporations can occupy the circle of human concern and all people outside the circle fighting each other. And I think the hard nut to crack in terms of creating a shared identity, not a common identity, shared identity in the United States and most of what's called Europe, is the whole notion of whiteness. Because the concept of whiteness as it evolved, which really evolved out of the American colonies in its hardest form, the very concept of whiteness is fear-based, separation, power over. So that's, and I'm not saying that just phenomenology, I'm saying that's what white identity was. If you think of the Bacon Rebellion, and the notion of whiteness was to actually have control over the racial other. The idea of the Enlightenment project was for man, and it largely was man, to have control over nature. And I say we like parks, but we hate the forest. You know, all the children's stories, Little Red Riding Hood, she went in the forest and something bad happened, right? What does the forest represent? Forests represent nature decolonized. And so the world, if we can colonize it, grass, stay where I put you. Trees, stay where I put you. I'm in control. We're never in control. That need for control in and of itself speaks to profound anxiety that's baked into the whole identity of whiteness. So the hard nut to crack is to begin to not only deconstruct that, but to offer a positive alternative. And we haven't really taken that up in a serious way.
Okay, I'd like the panel to comment on the worst Supreme Court decision of the 20th century. A 15-year-old girl is called to a courtroom. The judge tells her, go to the hospital to get your appendix removed. He secretly tells the surgeon to do a tubal ligation, cutting off the girl's fallopian tubes. We know what fallopian tubes are. The girl did not have a hearing. She did not have an attorney to represent her as a minor. She did not have a chance to appeal. She married when she was 17 and learned that she could not conceive. She tried to sue the judge for violations of due process and constitutional rights. When the case went to the Supreme Court, 3 judges said, a judge cannot operate like a loose cannon and inflict indiscriminate damage whenever he declares he is functioning in a judicial capacity. The other 5 jackasses on the Supreme Court said, we as judges are immune and can do whatever we want. How is the doctrine of judicial immunity consistent with a democracy where there are checks and balances? The judges have established a judicial dictatorship where they have proclaimed that they are above the law and that they cannot be held accountable. And Thomas Jefferson warned about this in his letters before he died.
Thank you for your comment.
Any comment?
Well, the court is way out of control for a lot of reasons, and I mean the last statement I think is actually the answer to your question. I mean there are so many bad cases by the Supreme Court, forced sterilization, the taking away of land from Native Americans, the supporting of slavery, the expansion of corporate doctrines. What we have now is the largest campaign in U.S. history, of restricting the rights to vote is going on right now. Right now, not 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's going on right now. So we're seeing this huge expansion in terms of corporate rights and this huge contraction in terms of human and civil rights. And they always go together. And that's what we miss. What you ended by is how can we do this in our democracy? And I think we've already heard we don't have a democracy. And we have to look at the institution design and actually think about how do we actually design a system. If we want a democracy that's really inclusive, how do we design that? And it would be a different role, different than we have right now. And even the idea of checks and balances, as important as they were largely about protecting the property in society. They were not about protecting people. Remember when the country became a republic, only 1/6 of the voting age population had the right to vote. In most states, you had to have property to vote. So it's aspirational. And in fact, I'll end by just saying this. The most controversial political speech by any president, according to most politicians, was the Gettysburg Address. And it's like, Gettysburg Address, isn't that what famous? What makes that so controversial? Lincoln starts off by saying 77 years ago. And that created a barnstorm. Why did 77 years ago create a barnstorm? Does anyone know? Because Lincoln did not make reference to the Constitution. He made reference to the Declaration of Independence. Because he was basically saying the Constitution of our country is flawed. It didn't have any concept of equality in the Constitution. The concept of equality that came to this country came through the Declaration of Independence and was sacrificed in the Constitution. Lincoln was very deliberate of not referencing the Constitution, but referencing the Declaration of Independence. He's not perfect, but he was saying we have a flawed system. And part of what I'm suggesting is the design of the system is flawed. It's not enough to just get right people elected. We have to design and then exercise a true democracy if we're going to have one.
Good evening. My name is Megan Edmonds. I'm a program assistant at the I Have a Dream Foundation on the Upper West Side. We're like in our after school program, we're like discussing this privilege and bias and like the stratification of things, and I'm really trying to keep them woke, these 17, 18-year-old people who will be, the future leaders. We actually discussed Audre Lorde on Wednesday, and to what Dr. Powell said about the Audre Lorde wrote about in 1980s about the fear of the others being necessary for a profit economy that profits off of surplus people, right? So it's awesome that we can bring all her knowledge back into today's in lieu of Women's History Month, right? But what Dr. Rooks was talking about, and what you mentioned earlier about how we don't have a democracy, we have an oligarchy, right? And I think what I really want to discuss is kind of like the elephant in the room, in the sense that that's one of our biggest problems, that what our issues are considered to be a personal problem or things that are for charity, like you were saying, like either charities or personal issues. But I think the issue with that is that we're not talking about like socialism, right? Like that's, to me, I think that's the elephant in the room, because I know as an American, a person who's neo-colonized mind about what socialism means and the visceral reaction that we have when we discuss changing our government. Because like they should have more responsibility in the social sector of like, we shouldn't have to have I Have a Dream Foundation to help, impoverished children get through the pipeline of education to only be met with, the systems that will continue to like oppress them continuously, because we're taking the responsibility away from our government that we fund and we like put into power. So I think what I really want to discuss is, I don't know, because I think we're kind of scared of even like talking about it. Like if it's not a democracy and it's an oligarchy, why can't we try to figure out like how to move past those two? Like why is it just those two options? Like why can't we discuss socialism? And I know communism is like some really awful thing, but I know when I was like discussing this with an immigrant African woman that I met at the AmeriCorps conference, New Year conference, mid-year conference this year, she was like, I really like the idea of communism. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about communism. I think I'm more into socialism myself. But like, I think I would like to have that conversation about like, what do you, our distinguished panel, feel about, socialism? Because I think, that's like what I'm into, So.
Okay. We're going, in the interest of time, so everyone's heard, we're just going to listen to all the questions and comments and then respond to them.
My name is Elizabeth Carey, a young artist from Connecticut. My question is sort of, it's all over the place. First, I wanted to make a commentary that I think part of the reason why America's in the situation that it is there is an intrinsic address to a certain level of intellect and how we see education and culture is quite different than many other countries in the way we address it and the way we create policy around it. And I wonder what you as a panel see as the differences and the parallels in how we address race, education, and particularly the interdependent relationship that both blacks from outside of this country that are from a formerly imperialized country, such as Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, particularly the Caribbean, from where my family's from, I wrote it down, my bad, and where the validity of certain I want to say a rivalry, I feel sometimes, but perhaps it's more, it's better to say the shared burden that each individual has within the socialized construct of institutionalized racism. And that's more or less it.
Thank you. Lonnie, do you have live stream? Okay.
Hi, my name's Emily Jarvis. I'm an organizational change student here at Milano. Sure. Is that better? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm in actually one of Derek's other classes, and we're doing a lot of reading right now, like very, peer-reviewed academic readings coming from writers like Elijah Anderson and William Wilson on the cultural versus structural reasoning behind racial disparity. And the cultural pole, as I'm understanding it, is both homogenizing and demonizing Black culture and promoting this personal responsibility narrative in fixing disparity that you were speaking to today. So I'm interested in knowing your opinion on what do we do to reframe the issue deeper into the structural argument, or should we be doing this reframing in an age that is fueled in identity politics?
Thanks. Yes. Okay, and these are the questions from the live stream. In the interest of time, I'm not speaking up. Hello? Okay, sorry. Please speak to how religion and patriarchy limit the ability of people to be humanistic and how they do in fact perpetuate oppression by scapegoating through the utilization of a God concept.
That's it? That's the one question? That's the one? Okay.
So in summary. Well, I'll just jump in with the socialism question, which I think actually connects with the question about how do we frame. Yes, how do we frame the structural issues in the era of identity politics? I don't know where she went that fast. Hi. Yeah. So because I think they're related, and the documentary I directed, Black in Cuba. We talk in the documentary, there's a moment where we break down, this is what socialism really is. This is what communism is. And we talk about the ways that these ideas have been completely distorted in the United States, right? And so it's difficult for us to have just a conversation about, the pros and cons of these things as an economic system, as a political system, right? Outside of these stereotypes that we have. So I think that part of thinking about how to reframe the structural issue is to get people opening their minds about what is possible in the different ways that people live outside of the United States, right? So, and to see, for example, in Cuba is essentially a laboratory, and there's just an article in the New York Times showing that as you introduce capitalist reforms, you introduce a capitalist market economy, you see immediately increased white supremacist ideology, increased racial exclusion, increased stratification, right? And they were only socialist from 1959 till about 1995 or so, right? So they had been capitalist all that time. But that quickly, when you introduce capitalism into a society, you see the impact. So I think that it's important to open our minds to other examples and alternatives. And there are, it's not a pie in the sky. We've come to understand these ideas as pie in the sky ideas, or ideas that have utterly failed. But we see, we thought, oh, well, Russia's problem was that they were communist. Capitalist Russia is not a great place to live. Right, so I think that's the key, is just to make sure that we have more accurate and grounded information about alternatives.
Well, I'll add, the part of the difficulty is that the term capitalism is too broad. We have several different systems that we call capitalist. From 1945 to 1975, equality was growing in the United States capitalist society. It still was a capitalist society. And that it's not a magical period. Blacks and people of color were largely excluded, but the overall push was to actually have greater equality. So something happened in this capitalist system to change it in around 1975. If you look at Sweden, if you look at Japan, if you look at Canada, all capitalist countries, they have nearly the inequality that the United States have. So it's not capitalism per se, whatever that means. Market economies are complicated, and the question is, how do we actually order them to do what we want them to do? And just saying capitalism, it doesn't tell us about all the moving parts. Virtually every capitalist country, mature capitalist country in the world had a universal health care system before the United States. Does it make a socialism or not? The other thing is that we're actually creating a world. And we can we can pull from many different segments. One of my favorite writers and authors on this is Roberto Unger, who's a Brazilian, and he teaches at Harvard. He talks about putting different systems together. So I would say to be much more in terms of experimentation, but no in terms of systems. If you're not careful, if you put one thing in place, the other things will displace that one thing. So you have to be, so it's not easy, but it's doable. But whether we call it socialism or capitalism is almost beside the point. What is it really doing? What is the system doing in terms of human flourishing, human capacity, quality, human dignity? And that should be the yardstick. The labels actually prevent us from looking at things in a much more nuanced way. In terms of religion, there's one of my favorite writers says secularism is religion without a God. So we have fundamental beliefs, and sometimes they serve us and don't serve us. One of the things we can say about most religions, and they're religions without gods, religions with gods, is they get captured by the elites and by the states and repurposed for that So it's not. So it's always this distortion. You know, what is Buddhism, Christianity, Islam? What are they really supposed to do? I don't know. But what we see is they get captured by the state and they become at least complicit, if not a servant of the state. It's clear that in terms of our basic fundamental notion of human dignity, that most major religions don't serve that. And when they try to serve it, they become oftentimes in conflict with the state. There are a number of books that actually talk about this. One is called Power, Inc., that talks about the fight between the church and the state, that then became the fight between capital and the state, or that we're actually in right now. And then a colleague of mine has written a book called Dog Whistle Politics that I made reference to. And then my book's over there called Racing to Justice. All of these really talk about these things. They have this long, sordid history. And then the last thing in terms of thinking about identity politics and race and structure and culture, I'd say, if I might, most sophisticated thinkers actually don't see a sharp break between culture and structure. Dr. Brooks made earlier reference to the Kerner Commission. Kerner Commission actually talked about that if we have the structure of inequality, we'd create a culture of poverty. So the culture of poverty is not freestanding. It's actually an adaptation to structural inequality. And what the conservatives have done, and Moynihan muddied the water, is they actually see this as two independent factors as opposed to them constantly being in relationship to each other. Now, the way that the right wing has sort of talked about the culture of poverty and personal responsibility is just a farce. Because the person that they're describing, the person that's free of structure and society and sociology, simply does not exist. That person is a fiction. There's nobody in the world that's free of all those things. Does it mean we have autonomy? We have autonomy, but it's not like what we think it is. It doesn't mean we're freestanding. It doesn't mean we're not affected. It's a much more complex choice. It's never freestanding. And what happens in terms of politics and the media, we like sound bites. And there's some things that don't lend themselves to sound bites. We're complicated creatures. We're social creatures. We're learning all this stuff about the mind science, of how the mind works. The unconscious, and I'll end by saying this, the unconscious, which is in a recursive relationship with structures, is social. It's not individual. And so, to some extent, the sociologists tell us this, the unit of measurement is not the individual. The individual is actually a product of social structure, culture. The question is, how do we actually think about this and use this in terms of a progressive, inclusive world? And I think that becomes a challenge.
Yeah, I did talk about sound bites. I'm trying to do this as sound bites. So for the culture versus structure, I think one of the things that has long been troubling to me about the way some sociologists want to talk about Black folks is to coin the title of a book by a historian named Darrell Scott. He said it's either contempt or pity. If you can find sociologists in particular who are not ending up in a whole contempt and pity dichotomy, you've done something. Because it is one of the primary ways that that discipline allows you to talk about Black folks and get some kind of social capital back from it. You can talk about Black people in kind of way you want to, but will you get published, will you get invited to prestigious places, will folks ask your opinion about things? You better be in that binary, which started with W.B. Du Bois, to be clear. He kicked that off, and it has continued. But the way that they talk about culture is not a culture the way that I recognize it, coming from humanistic fields, a culture that shows the cracks so the sunlight can get through, right? That's not about the surface. That's where the life and the humanity and the complexity comes through. That's not the way the sociologists that I read want to, or have read, want to talk about culture. So I have some, I'm sort of like, that's why I'm like, y'all, people need to be interdisciplinary. This is the problem. Like when you're in one discipline, or even in the social sciences, people get used to talking about things in a way, and it's almost at odds with the ways that people in English are going to talk to you about culture, how they're going to describe Black people. It's just bears no relationship to each other. So, you know, what that's why I'm constantly saying, when I say interdisciplinarity, I don't mean social scientists talking to each other. I literally mean musicians and poets and writers and historians and storytellers and coming together to solve some of these issues. What I often say about Black studies in particular is that our bibliography, the bibliography that comes out of Black studies about people writing writings by and about Black people, the answer to any social problem we got in our communities is there. If we know it all, you gotta know it all, and you gotta put it in dialogue with each other. Toni Morrison got as much to tell you about homelessness and displacement as William Julius Wilson ever will. Right, but you have to know both in order to do something with it. In terms of the question, so you will start a fight talking about ethnic differences within Black folks. People do not like to talk about that. I get in trouble constantly because it's in my book. So, but I'm just saying, like, if it doesn't get talked about a lot, it's because it makes people, especially if you want to talk about that in relation to education. Is the new school like other schools, other kind of elite schools? The majority of Black folks here are recent immigrant descent? No, y'all are different? No, yes?
I don't know.
I'm asking, so let me tell you, at Harvard College, 75% of the folks who claim Black are first or second generation immigrants. I'm saying more recent, right? At Princeton, 68% of more recent immigrant descent. So I don't know what the new school is like. At Cornell, it's in the 60s. It's in the high 60s of more recent immigrant descent, and there's all kinds of reasons for that that are complex, that and generally have nothing to do with the individuals. It has to do with the preferences of the institutions for a variety of reasons. But so it's a complex conversation that absolutely needs to be had. But generally, you won't talk about race making people uncomfortable. You start talking about differences within Blackness. I mean, blows can be struck. People will be like, let's just shut that down. Like, you know, but it does need to be talked about. It absolutely does. I think you're right. And the whole thing about patriarchy and religion, I mean, yeah, okay, patriarchy, religion, and white supremacy. They're like, you know, the triplets, right? That are responsible for an awful lot of suffering, pain, heartache, death in the world. Yes, they're all on the table.
Well, I want to thank, join me in thanking our panelists, Noliwe Rooks and John Powell. John, I imagine, is available for book signing if you are interested in his, what seems to me most likely to be a fascinating book. It is available over there. Noliwe's work available on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yes, check her out on Amazon. And thank you, and please come back for more public policy and actions. There's more to come that's fascinating. Thank you all so much.